My name is Eleanor. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe as steady, the dependable one, the daughter who doesn't cause trouble, the woman who listens more than she speaks and finishes what she starts without asking for applause. If you met me briefly, you might think I'm soft-spoken, maybe even easy to overlook. I've been underestimated that way for as long as I can remember. At work, in family conversations, in rooms where decisions were being made just slightly out of my earshot. People tend to assume that calm equals consent, that silence equals comfort, that reliability means you don't need much in return. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or dramatizing pain for effect. It's about something quieter, and in many ways, harder to name. It's about fairness, perception, and the moment you realize that being the reasonable one can slowly cost you more than anyone ever intended to take. My parents promised equal inheritance, then split it. 70-30. Numbers tend to make people pick sides immediately. I want to ask you not to do that yet, because this story isn't really about money. It's about what those numbers represented long before they were written down. It's about years of small assumptions stacking up, unnoticed, until they became policy. What still stays with me is not the legal meeting or the paperwork. It's that moment afterward when I finally asked why. The explanation was one sentence long. No shouting, no argument. Just a calm statement that revealed more about how I had been seen my entire life than any conflict ever could. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through this slowly. You'll hear about the role I played in my family, the ways I made myself useful, and the ways that usefulness quietly turned into expectation. You'll hear about the shift that happened inside me long before anyone else noticed anything was wrong. And you'll hear about the choices I made, not impulsively, not angrily, but deliberately. There are no villains here in the cinematic sense, no sudden twists of fate. Just ordinary people, familiar dynamics, and the long shadow they can cast if no one ever questions them. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I think many of us have lived some version of it. Maybe not with inheritance, maybe not with parents, but with systems, families, workplaces, relationships, that reward you for being quiet right up until the moment they decide you don't need to be considered at all. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever been seen as the strong one, so consistently that no one noticed when you were the one absorbing the cost? For most of my life, I was the easy one. That was the word my parents used when talking about me to relatives, neighbors, and even to my younger brother while I was still in the room. Easy. As if I were a low-maintenance appliance that never broke down, never needed replacing, never asked for upgrades. I learned early what that word really meant. I was the child who didn't need reminders. I finished the homework without supervision. I didn't slam doors. I didn't argue when plans changed. If something needed to be handled, paperwork, phone calls, appointments, I quietly stepped in before anyone had to ask. My parents wore their exhaustion openly, and I took pride in being the one who didn't add to it. No one ever told me to do this. That's the part people misunderstand. I wasn't pressured. I wasn't controlled. I simply noticed what made life smoother for everyone else, and I adjusted myself accordingly. At family gatherings, my brother was described as ambitious or driven. His risks were praised. His detours were framed as experiments. When he failed at something, it was temporary. When I succeeded, it was expected. My achievements were mentioned briefly, like housekeeping updates. Useful information, but not conversation-worthy. If there was tension in the room, I absorbed it. If there was conflict, I mediated it. I became fluent in reading the emotional weather before anyone else felt the first drop of rain. People often confuse that with weakness. It wasn't. It was awareness, just uncelebrated awareness. The role solidified quietly over time. I was the daughter who could handle things. the one who could be trusted, the one who didn't need checking in on because I always seemed fine. When my parents needed help understanding financial documents, they called me. When a medical form needed reviewing, they handed it to me. When my brother needed space to figure himself out, I was the one who filled the gap without comment. And I didn't resent it, not at first. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being competent and calm. You're always present, but rarely centered. People rely on you the way they rely on infrastructure, electricity, plumbing, roads. Essential, but unnoticed unless something goes wrong. What's strange is that I was often praised and dismissed in the same breath. "You're so capable," my mother would say, right before explaining why she didn't worry about my future the way she worried about my brother's. "You'll be fine," my father would add, as if that settled something important. I internalized those words deeply. Being fine became a standard I lived up to, not realizing it was also a ceiling. If I didn't struggle visibly, I didn't need support. If I didn't complain, nothing was wrong. If I didn't ask, nothing was owed. In photos from those years, I'm always slightly to the side, leaning in, not centered, smiling but not demanding attention. I didn't notice it then. I notice it now. The truth is, my family loved me. I don't question that. But love doesn't automatically equal awareness. And awareness, when absent for long enough, creates patterns that feel natural to everyone except the person quietly accommodating them. I became the reliable constant in a system that slowly reorganized itself around my steadiness. Decisions were made with the assumption that I would adapt. Sacrifices were balanced on the belief that I could absorb them. My needs were postponed, not denied outright, just deferred indefinitely. No one ever said, "Eleanor will take less." They didn't have to. They had years of evidence that I would make less feel like enough. At the time, I believed that being trusted was the same as being valued. It took much longer to understand the difference. And this matters because by the time the inheritance conversation came years later, the outcome didn't begin in that lawyer's office. It began decades earlier, in all the small moments where I was quietly categorized as the one who didn't need as much. That's who I was to them. Not invisible, just accounted for last. The first time it happened, it was small enough that I almost convinced myself it didn't matter. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, the plates still out. The kind of moment that feels casual and unimportant until you replay it years later with sharper eyes. My parents were talking about helping my brother with a down payment. He had found a place, too expensive in my opinion, but full of potential, according to them. They spoke about it as if it were already decided. Numbers were mentioned. Time frames. Options. I listened, nodding, asking a few practical questions about interest rates and repayment, because that was my reflex. To help clarify, not to challenge. Then my mother turned to me and said lightly, almost kindly, "You don't need help like that. You've always been good with money." That was it. That was the sentence. No one looked at me to see how I received it. The conversation simply moved on, flowing around me like water around a stone. I smiled, because that's what I did in moments that didn't seem worth interrupting. I told myself it was logical. I told myself it made sense. After all, I was good with money. I had been careful. I had built my life without assistance. But something about that exchange lodged itself in my memory. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't. Not because it was unfair on the surface. It could be defended easily. What stayed with me was the assumption underneath it that my self-sufficiency disqualified me from consideration. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the tone more than the words. There had been relief in her voice. Relief that she didn't have to worry about me. Relief that one problem was already solved by virtue of my personality. I didn't bring it up the next day, or the day after that. I didn't want to seem petty or transactional or like I was keeping score. I told myself families don't need to be perfectly balanced to be loving. But from that point on, I started noticing similar moments everywhere. When my brother needed time off work to reset, my parents offered to help with expenses. When I mentioned being overwhelmed, my father said, You've always managed. That's your strength. When resources were discussed, his needs were framed as investments. Mine were framed as unnecessary. Each moment, on its own, was defensible, reasonable, explainable. Together, they formed a pattern, and still, no one else reacted. That was the part that made me doubt myself. My brother didn't gloat. My parents didn't act secretive. There was no dramatic shift in behavior. Everything stayed warm, functional, normal. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that noticing didn't mean accusing. That feeling, a twinge, didn't mean there was a wound. I rationalized my silence as maturity. I thought I was choosing harmony, but deep down something had changed. Not outwardly, internally. I began to understand that fairness in my family wasn't about equal distribution. It was about perceived need. And need, in their eyes, was something I had carefully trained them not to see in me. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me alert. The cut was small, barely visible. But it was the first time I understood that my role came with a quiet cost. And that cost was being excluded, not because I was less loved, but because I was less worried about. No one apologized. No one needed to. Nothing had technically gone wrong. But from that moment on, I stopped assuming that being capable automatically meant being secure. I started paying closer attention. What's dangerous about subtle patterns is how quickly they begin to feel normal. After that first moment at the kitchen table, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. I simply continued being who I had always been. On the outside, nothing changed. On the inside, I started keeping mental notes, quiet observations I never shared out loud. The small dismissals kept coming, spaced far enough apart that each one felt isolated. A comment here, a decision there. Always reasonable. Always explainable. Always just short of something you could point to and say, "This is wrong." When my brother decided to go back to school, my parents offered to cover part of the tuition. They framed it as encouragement, as belief in his potential. When I mentioned a certification that would advance my career, my mother smiled and said, "You don't need more credentials. You're already doing so well." The words sounded supportive. The outcome wasn't. I learned to translate the language. "You'll be fine" meant you're not a priority. "You don't need help" meant your needs don't count. "We worry about him more" meant you can carry your own weight and some of his, too. Still, I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I was trying to be fair. I told myself that my parents were doing their best, that they loved us both, that families aren't spreadsheets, and that's how normalization happens. You explain away what hurts because it doesn't hurt enough. You minimize your reaction because you don't want to seem dramatic. You convince yourself that being understanding is the same as being respected. Over time, I noticed something else. My silence was being interpreted as agreement. When my parents discussed future plans, retirement, downsizing, what we'll leave behind someday, they spoke as if the distribution was already emotionally settled. My brother was discussed in terms of protection. I was discussed in terms of resilience. "You're strong," my father would say with pride. "You won't mind," my mother would add, without realizing what she was asking. I minded, but I didn't interrupt. I told myself that if it ever crossed a real line, I would speak up. I just didn't realize how far that line could move while I stood still. There's a strange kind of self-betrayal that happens when you keep the peace long enough. You begin to distrust your own discomfort. You start asking whether your feelings are justified, whether you're being selfish, whether wanting balance means you're ungrateful. I wasn't being openly disrespected. That's what made it so confusing. I was being quietly deprioritized, and because it happened in a loving environment, it felt almost wrong to name it. So I normalized it. I adjusted my expectations downward. I stopped imagining equal treatment as something natural. I began assuming I would receive less, not just materially, but emotionally. Less checking in, less concern, less room to need anything. And in doing so, I made it easier for everyone else to continue exactly as they were. What I didn't see yet was that every time I stayed silent, I was reinforcing a narrative about who I was and what I deserved. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but effectively. By the time the inheritance was formally discussed years later, the groundwork had already been laid. The imbalance didn't feel shocking to them. It felt consistent. To me, it felt like the inevitable conclusion of a story I had been quietly co-writing without realizing it. I thought I was choosing patience. I didn't realize I was teaching people how to overlook me. The moment I understood my role, it wasn't during an argument or a dramatic family meeting. It was during something far more ordinary. My parents were planning a move. Smaller house, fewer stairs, closer to medical facilities just in case. They called me first, not to ask what I thought, but to ask what needed to be done. Could I review listings, compare neighborhoods, help with the paperwork? Of course I could. I always could. While we talked logistics, my brother's name came up only once, and only in passing. He was busy, stressed, going through a lot. I noticed how naturally the division of labor fell into place. I was the executor in training, the planner, the one who translated complexity into calm. My brother was the one whose life needed to be protected from inconvenience. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. That night, I sat at my desk with my leather notebook open in front of me. It wasn't a diary. I'd never kept one. It was more practical than that. Lists, reminders, occasional observations. And for the first time, I wrote something that wasn't actionable. I wrote, "They see me as infrastructure." It wasn't bitter. It was accurate. Infrastructure is relied upon, but rarely thanked. It's designed to hold weight. It isn't supposed to ask for reinforcement. And when it functions well, people forget it's even there. Once I saw the role clearly, I started noticing how consistently it showed up. I was consulted but not centered. Trusted but not protected. Included but not considered vulnerable. I was the backup plan, the safety net, the emotional and logistical buffer that allowed everyone else to move more freely. And the most unsettling part? Everyone believed this was a compliment. "You're the one we don't worry about," my mother said once, squeezing my hand. "You're so capable," my father repeated, as if that explained everything. I realized then that my reliability had become a justification, a reason, a story they told themselves to make unequal treatment feel fair. They weren't choosing my brother over me. They were choosing who they believed needed them more. And because I had never visibly needed them, I had quietly volunteered to be the one who received less. This wasn't something I could fix with a single conversation. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system, built slowly, reinforced gently, and maintained by everyone's good intentions, including mine. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Clarity changes the way you listen. When my parents talked about taking care of things in the future, I stopped assuming I was included by default. When they spoke about fairness, I listened for definitions, not reassurances. And when I imagined the future, inheritance, responsibility, legacy, I stopped picturing equality as a given. I started asking myself what I would do if it wasn't offered. That was the beginning of something important. Not action yet, not resistance, just awareness. Once you understand the role you've been assigned, you have a choice. Continue performing it, or begin preparing for what happens when you no longer do. I didn't announce anything. I didn't withdraw support. I didn't change how I showed up. But internally, I stepped out of character. And that changed everything. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment anyone else would recognize as significant. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in a quiet office with neutral walls and a ticking clock. My parents had asked me to come with them to review some documents. Estate planning, they said. Nothing urgent, just getting things in order. I sat beside them, reading carefully, asking clarifying questions, translating legal language into plain terms the way I always did. At one point, the advisor slid a summary page across the table. 2 columns, 2 names, 70, 30. I didn't react. Not outwardly. My face stayed neutral. My breathing is steady. Years of composure had trained me well. The advisor explained it clinically, as if it were a mathematical preference, not a relational one. My parents nodded along. No one looked at me. The room felt oddly distant, like I was watching a scene through glass. Afterward, in the parking lot, I finally asked, not emotionally, not defensively, just a simple question. Can you help me understand why? My father answered immediately. He didn't hesitate. Your brother needs more support. That was it. The explanation was one sentence long. No preamble. No apology. No acknowledgement that this might land heavily. Just a statement of fact in his mind. Logical. Settled. In that moment, something inside me clicked into place. I understood then that this wasn't about oversight, or temporary imbalance, or even favoritism in the way people usually mean it. This was about identity, about who they believed I was, and who they believed my brother was. He was someone to be buffered from risk. I was someone expected to absorb it. Standing there, keys in my hand, I felt an unexpected calm. Not numbness, clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't point out my contributions, my sacrifices, my consistency. I didn't remind them of the ways I had shown up when things were difficult. None of that would have changed the underlying belief. So I nodded. I understand, I said. And in that moment, I truly did. What they didn't realize was that my understanding wasn't agreement. It was the acceptance of a reality I had been circling for years. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I just thought about how long I had been preparing others for this outcome by being endlessly capable. About how my silence had been read as consent. About how fairness in my family was defined by perceived fragility, not by contribution. That day marked the end of something. Not my relationship with my parents. Not my sense of self-worth. It marked the end of my expectation that quiet reliability would ever be rewarded with consideration. From that point on, my silence changed. It stopped being habitual. It became intentional. And that distinction between being quiet because you're overlooked and being quiet because you're choosing to observe makes all the difference. I didn't make any decisions that day. I didn't need to. The shift had already happened. After that day, nothing on the surface changed. And that was the most revealing part. My parents still call, still asked for help, still spoke to me with warmth and familiarity. My brother still assumed things would work out in his favor. No one sensed a rupture, because there wasn't one. What had changed was internal. My silence was no longer reflexive. It was deliberate. I stopped filling conversational gaps with reassurance. When my parents talked about future plans, I listened without offering solutions unless asked directly. When assumptions were made about what I would be fine with, I noted them instead of correcting them. This wasn't passive aggression. It was data collection. People often think silence is weakness because they assume it means you have nothing to say. In reality, silence can mean you're choosing not to interrupt the truth while it reveals itself. I paid attention to what was said and what wasn't. No one asked how I felt about the inheritance decision after that day. Not once. The topic simply vanished, as if it had been resolved by my lack of reaction. That absence of follow-up told me more than any argument could have. I realized something else during that period. My parents weren't trying to hurt me. They were protecting a story they had told themselves for years. A story where they were fair, loving, and practical. Questioning the outcome would have required questioning the narrative, so I didn't push. Instead, I began quietly separating support from sacrifice. I still helped when asked, but I stopped anticipating needs. I stopped volunteering extra labor to smooth outcomes I hadn't chosen. I stopped translating other people's comfort into my responsibility. No one noticed right away. Why would they? The system had always depended on me giving more than was requested. When I stopped doing that, it felt like nothing was wrong, just slightly less convenient. And convenience is rarely missed until it's gone. My silence during this time was mistaken for acceptance. That misconception gave me space. Space to think. Space to prepare. Space to consider what dignity looked like in a system that had already decided what I deserved. I didn't confront my brother. There was no point. He was playing the role assigned to him just as faithfully as I had played mine. What mattered now was understanding my leverage. Not over them, but over my own future. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine outcomes where I was no longer the stabilizer, where I didn't compensate for the imbalance with grace, where I let consequences unfold naturally. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. People reveal what they expect from you when you stop performing, and what they expected from me was clear: adaptability, endurance, compliance without complaint. Seeing that expectation clearly was strangely freeing, because once you understand what others assume you'll tolerate, you can decide, quietly, firmly, what you no longer will. What they never noticed was how well I observe when I stop speaking. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being underestimated. People don't hide things from you. They assume you won't use what you see. They talk freely. They explain themselves without realizing they're leaving a record. While everyone else carried on as usual, I began preparing, not emotionally, but structurally. I started by reviewing documents I already had access to. Not secretly, not improperly, just carefully. Emails, old financial summaries, notes from conversations I'd helped facilitate years earlier. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for clarity. Patterns, once seen, tend to repeat. I noticed how often I had been included in planning, but excluded from outcomes. How my name appeared on drafts, but disappeared from final decisions. How responsibility flowed toward me, while benefits flowed elsewhere. So I began documenting, quietly, methodically, not as ammunition, as orientation. I learned more about estate structures, trusts, and long-term financial planning than I ever had before. Not because I planned to challenge anything, but because I refused to be uninformed again. Knowledge, I realized, was the one form of leverage no one could take from me. I also took stock of my own position, my savings, my career trajectory, my flexibility. I assessed what I actually needed versus what I had been conditioned to believe I should be grateful for. What surprised me most was how much room I had, because I had always been careful. Because I had always planned for myself. Because I had never assumed support would arrive automatically. The very traits that had justified giving me less had also made me more independent than anyone realized. I stopped centering my parents' future in my own plans. Not out of spite, out of realism. I recalibrated timelines, reassigned priorities, updated beneficiaries, adjusted expectations. No one noticed these changes because no one was looking in my direction. I also noticed how often people assumed I would step in if needed. That phrase, if needed, carried an entire future inside it. A future where I would absorb consequences that had already been decided without me. So I quietly removed myself from those assumptions. I didn't announce boundaries. I built them invisibly. This phase of preparation wasn't dramatic. It was almost boring. Reading, learning, accounting, thinking. But it was the most powerful work I had ever done. Because power, I learned, doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from not being surprised. By the time I finished preparing, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was oriented. They still saw me as the one who would adapt. They had no idea I was preparing for a future where I wouldn't need to. And that difference between who they thought I was and who I was becoming was about to matter. What they never noticed was how well I observe when I stop speaking. There's a particular invisibility that comes with being underestimated. People don't hide things from you. They assume you won't use what you see. They talk freely. They explain themselves without realizing they're leaving a record. While everyone else carried on as usual, I began preparing, not emotionally, but structurally. I started by reviewing documents I already had access to. Not secretly, not improperly, just carefully. Emails, old financial summaries, notes from conversations I'd helped facilitate years earlier. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for clarity. Patterns, once seen, tend to repeat. I noticed how often I had been included in planning, but excluded from outcomes. How my name appeared on drafts but disappeared from final decisions. How responsibility flowed toward me while benefits flowed elsewhere. So I began documenting quietly, methodically, not as ammunition, as orientation. I learned more about estate structures, trusts, and long-term financial planning than I ever had before. Not because I planned to challenge anything, but because I refused to be uninformed again. Knowledge, I realized, was the one form of leverage no one could take from me. I also took stock of my own position, my savings, my career trajectory, my flexibility. I assessed what I actually needed versus what I had been conditioned to believe I should be grateful for. What surprised me most was how much room I had, because I had always been careful, because I had always planned for myself, because I had never assumed support would arrive automatically. The very traits that had justified giving me less had also made me more independent than anyone realized. I stopped centering my parents' future in my own plans. Not out of spite, out of realism. I recalibrated timelines, reassigned priorities, updated beneficiaries, adjusted expectations. No one noticed these changes because no one was looking in my direction. I also noticed how often people assumed I would step in if needed. That phrase, if needed, carried an entire future inside it. A future where I would absorb consequences that had already been decided without me. So I quietly removed myself from those assumptions. I didn't announce boundaries. I built them invisibly. This phase of preparation wasn't dramatic. It was almost boring. Reading, learning, accounting, thinking. But it was the most powerful work I had ever done. Because power, I learned, doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from not being surprised. By the time I finished preparing, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was oriented. They still saw me as the one who would adapt. They had no idea I was preparing for a future where I wouldn't need to. And that difference between who they thought I was and who I was becoming was about to matter. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It arrived the way truth often does when you've been circling it long enough. Quietly, almost politely. I was sitting alone at my dining table late one evening, papers spread out in neat stacks. No wine, no music. Just a lamp and the soft hum of the city outside my window. I had reached the point where information stopped being abstract and started forming a picture. And the picture was clear. I realized that my parents' plan relied on something they had never explicitly discussed with me, but had fully assumed. They assumed I would continue to be the stabilizer, not just emotionally, practically, logistically, in ways that didn't appear on any legal document but were embedded in the structure of their decisions. The inheritance split wasn't just about distribution, it was about expectation. The expectation that I would compensate, care coordination, administrative tasks, emergency decision-making. The invisible labor that comes with aging parents. None of that had been assigned on paper. But every previous pattern suggested it would land with me. And here was the quiet truth. The plan only worked because I existed in it as unpaid infrastructure. That was the moment of private revelation. Not that the system was unfair, but that it was incomplete without my continued, unquestioned participation. Once I saw that, I understood my leverage. Leverage doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be announced. Sometimes it's simply the recognition that a structure depends on you more than it admits. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. Because leverage, when paired with restraint, creates options. I realized I could step back. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but cleanly. I could remove myself from roles I had never formally accepted. I could decline responsibilities that had been silently pre-assigned to me. I could stop being the balancing weight in a system that had already decided how much I was worth. Nothing illegal, nothing unethical, just alignment. That night, I made a decision, not about them, but about me. I would no longer provide support that wasn't matched with consideration. I would no longer subsidize the imbalance with my silence. And I would do it without confrontation, because confrontation would only reinforce the narrative that I was emotional rather than precise. The power wasn't in forcing change. It was in letting the existing plan operate without my quiet corrections. When you stop compensating, systems reveal their weaknesses, and I was finally willing to let that happen. I closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and for the first time since that parking lot conversation, I slept without rehearsing anything in my head. Clarity does that. It settles you. People imagine decision points as moments filled with emotion, heart racing, mind spiraling, a dramatic sense of finality. This one wasn't like that. It was quiet, almost administrative. Once I understood my leverage, I didn't rush to use it. I laid out the options carefully, the way I would for any complex project. I wrote them down, not to dramatize them, but to see them clearly. Option 1 was the familiar one. Continue as I had been. Accept the 70-30 split. Remain a reliable presence. Absorb the unseen labor. Tell myself that fairness isn't always equal, that love expresses itself in different ways. That option came with certainty. It was predictable. It required nothing new from anyone else, especially me. Option 2 was confrontation. A family meeting, a request for reconsideration, an appeal to contribution, history, and balance. I could explain how much I had carried. I could ask them to see me differently. But that option depended on something I no longer trusted, their ability to reinterpret me. It required them to dismantle a story they had relied on for decades. And it would have turned my clarity into a negotiation. The third option was quieter and irreversible. I could accept the terms as they were, without argument, and remove myself from the assumptions that made them workable. I could stop playing the role that allowed the imbalance to function smoothly. I could let responsibility follow allocation. That option didn't ask anyone else to change. It only required me to stop compensating. It was the most honest option. I sat with that for a long time. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood the weight of it. Once you step out of a role, you don't get to step back in without cost. Systems adapt, but relationships remember. Choosing that option meant accepting a different future, not just financially, but relationally. It meant allowing disappointment to exist without rushing to soothe it. It meant being willing to be misunderstood. What tipped the scale wasn't anger, it was alignment. I realized that continuing as before would require me to betray what I now knew, and confronting them would center my pain in a system that had already deprioritized it. Silence paired with action was truer. So I chose the irreversible option, not dramatically, not ceremonially. I didn't announce it to anyone. I didn't mark the day. I simply adjusted my behavior to match reality. From that point on, I would only participate where responsibility and consideration were proportionate. I would no longer correct outcomes I hadn't been invited to shape. This wasn't punishment, it was consistency. And consistency, unlike arguments, has a way of revealing truth without saying a word. That was the decision point. Everything after it was just a consequence. Once the decision was made, there was nothing cinematic about what followed. No declarations, no emotional distance, no visible rupture. I simply began moving in silence. The first changes were almost imperceptible. I stopped being the automatic first call. When emails came in that clearly belonged to everyone, I didn't reply first. When plans were floated vaguely, "We'll figure it out later," I let later arrive without having quietly figured it out for them in advance. I didn't withdraw help. I withdrew preemptive help. That distinction mattered. I also began restructuring my own life in ways that aligned with the reality I had accepted. I updated my financial planning, not in anticipation of an inheritance, but in recognition that I would not rely on it. I redirected long-term savings, rebalanced risk, and made decisions that assumed full independence, emotionally and practically. I made these moves quietly because they were mine to make. When my parents talked about future needs, I listened without translating their uncertainty into my obligation. When they said, "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," I let the bridge remain uncrossed. For the first time, I allowed gaps to exist. What surprised me was how long it took anyone to notice. The system had been so accustomed to my silent corrections that their absence didn't immediately register as a problem. It just felt slightly less smooth. A delay here, a missed detail there. Nothing alarming, nothing worth addressing. And because I wasn't visibly upset, no one assumed anything had changed. That's the power of moving in silence. You don't trigger defenses. You don't invite debate. You let reality adjust on its own timeline. I also stopped managing emotional expectations. When disappointment surfaced, subtle, confused, I didn't rush to reassure. I let discomfort sit where it belonged. Not because I wanted anyone to suffer, but because I was no longer willing to absorb feelings that weren't mine to resolve. In practical terms, this meant something very simple. I responded only to what was asked, not to what was implied. If clarity was needed, I waited to be invited into the conversation. If decisions were made without me, I didn't volunteer to fix their consequences. I matched my level of involvement to my level of inclusion. Nothing about this was cruel. It was precise. And precision has a way of exposing imbalance far more effectively than protest ever could. By the end of that phase, my life felt calmer than it had in years. Not lighter, calmer. Because I was no longer bracing for unspoken responsibility. They still believed I was the same Eleanor. And in many ways, I was. The difference was that I had stopped protecting the system from the truth of itself. Consequences rarely arrive as explosions. More often, they appear as inconveniences. The first signs were subtle enough that they could still be dismissed. A missed deadline. A document that hadn't been reviewed. A phone call that didn't get returned as quickly as everyone had come to expect. My parents didn't confront me about these things. They were confused by them. Confusion is different. It carries curiosity instead of accusation. "Did you see that email?" my mother asked once lightly. "I thought you were handling that," my father said another time, not unkindly. I answered honestly. "No, I didn't realize it was mine." I wasn't included in that conversation. Both statements were true. At first, they adjusted around the gaps. My brother stepped in occasionally, though awkwardly. Tasks took longer. Decisions stalled. The efficiency they had grown accustomed to began to erode. Not catastrophically, just enough to be felt. And that's when discomfort set in. Not anger, not blame. Discomfort. The unsettling feeling that something familiar was missing, but no one was quite sure what or why. They still didn't connect it to the inheritance decision. Why would they? In their minds, that issue had been settled calmly and reasonably. I hadn't objected. I hadn't asked for change. So the consequences seemed unrelated, random, temporary. But systems don't care about intention. They respond to structure. Without my quiet mediation, small issues accumulated. Appointments were double booked. Forms were filled out incorrectly. Advice from professionals went unclarified. Things that had once been streamlined began to feel heavier. I watched this without satisfaction and without guilt. This wasn't punishment. It was exposure. My brother began to feel the weight too. He was asked to coordinate things he'd never had to before. To manage details he wasn't practiced at handling. He didn't complain, but he struggled. For the first time, the distribution of effort began to mirror the distribution of resources. That's when tension quietly entered the room. Not toward me, toward the situation, toward aging, toward complexity, toward the realization that the family's functional balance had relied on an unspoken arrangement that no one had formally acknowledged. And still, no one asked me directly why things felt different. They just felt it. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It lets others discover what your absence, or restraint, really means. I remained calm, present, polite, but no longer compensating. And once compensation stops, the true cost of decisions begins to surface. There's a moment when discomfort turns into recognition. It doesn't happen loudly. No one announces it. It arrives quietly, the way a room changes temperature before anyone notices the draft. For my parents, that moment came gradually, and then all at once. The small inefficiencies that had first seemed like a coincidence began stacking up. Not catastrophically, but persistently. Each one demanded attention. Each one required energy. And for the first time, there was no obvious place for that energy to come from. My mother began calling me more often, not to assign tasks directly, but to talk around them. "We're just trying to understand everything," she said one afternoon. It feels like things are getting more complicated lately, my father added another time. I listened. I didn't rush to translate confusion into action. That's when the questions started changing. They weren't about logistics anymore. They were about why things felt harder. Why did nothing seem to move as smoothly? Why was there always something unresolved? And beneath those questions was another one they hadn't asked yet, but were beginning to feel. Why isn't Eleanor handling this? The realization didn't land cleanly. It came with resistance. At first, they assumed it was temporary, that I was busy, that work was demanding, that life had simply shifted. These explanations were comforting because they didn't require re-examination, only patience. But patience doesn't fix structural absence. The turning point came during a meeting with a professional, someone neutral, efficient, and unfamiliar with our family dynamics. They asked a simple question about coordination, about decision authority, about who was responsible for follow-through. My parents looked at each other. Then almost automatically they said my name. The professional paused. Is she involved in this process? There was a silence. Not a dramatic one, just long enough to be noticeable. Well, my father said slowly, she usually helps with these things. Usually, the professional repeated. But is she involved now? They didn't have an answer. That silence followed them home. For the first time, the assumption that I would simply be there was challenged. Not by me, but by circumstance. And once an assumption is questioned, it can't return to its original shape. That's when urgency crept in. Not panic yet, but concern. My mother began asking more directly whether I had time, whether I could just take a look, whether I might be willing to help, like before. The phrasing mattered. It wasn't can you handle this, but would you be willing? That was new. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree. I asked questions instead. What part are you asking me to be responsible for? Who's making the final decision? What expectations would come with that? These weren't confrontational questions. They were practical, reasonable. The same kinds of questions I had always answered for everyone else, now redirected outward. And suddenly, everything slowed down. Because clarity requires ownership, and ownership once named reveals an imbalance very quickly. That's when anxiety entered the picture. My parents began to sense, not consciously at first, that something had shifted beneath the surface. That the old equilibrium was gone. That the version of me they had quietly relied on was no longer operating by default. Still, they didn't connect it to the inheritance. Not yet. Instead, they framed it as distance, as independence. As for me, having my own life now, these explanations were safer, less threatening. They preserved the idea that nothing fundamental had changed, but things had changed, and the consequences were no longer abstract. Decisions were delayed because no one wanted to be responsible for them. Tasks were revisited multiple times because no one was confident they were complete. Stress accumulated because effort was being spent inefficiently. For the first time, my brother felt it too. He began reaching out, not to ask for help, but to express confusion. I didn't realize how much there was to manage, he said once. I thought you just did it. There was no accusation in his voice, just surprise. I listened. I didn't fill the gap. That was when the discomfort crossed into something else. Regret, not explicit, not spoken out loud, but present in tone, in pacing, in the way conversations hesitated where they once flowed. My parents started revisiting old decisions aloud, as if testing them. We thought this would be simpler. We assumed things would balance out. We didn't expect it to feel this heavy. Each sentence circled the truth without naming it, because naming it would have required acknowledging that the structure they designed, the one that allocated resources unevenly, had also assumed my continued invisible labor. And that assumption was no longer holding. The unspoken realization settled in slowly. It wasn't just that I was less involved. It was that they no longer had the option of quietly leaning on me without consequence. By the time they reached that understanding, it was already too late to reverse it. Not because I wouldn't help, but because the conditions under which I had helped no longer existed. You can't unsee clarity. You can't unknow what someone is willing to tolerate. And you can't retroactively renegotiate respect once it's been priced into a system. They could feel the loss, but they couldn't fix it. Because fixing it would have required more than an adjustment. It would have required redefinition. And redefinition, at that stage, would have meant admitting that the original explanation, the one sentence that justified everything, had cost more than anyone had calculated. By the time that truth became unavoidable, the moment for easy repair had passed. Not with anger, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of something realized too late. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It happened on a quiet afternoon, over tea. No raised voices, no tight expressions. Just a table, 3 cups, and a heaviness that had been circling for months without a place to land. My mother was the one who spoke first. "We've noticed you've been less involved," she said carefully, as if testing the words before releasing them. I nodded. Not defensively, not apologetically, just acknowledging the truth of the statement. My father followed, his tone measured. "We weren't sure if we'd done something wrong." That was the opening. Not an accusation, an uncertainty. I took a breath before answering. Not because I was emotional, but because I wanted to be precise. "I don't think anyone did anything wrong," I said. "I think things were decided in a way that made sense to you at the time." They waited. I could see it in their posture. The expectation that I would soften what came next. Translate it. Cushion it. I didn't. When the inheritance was split, I continued, it clarified something for me. About how responsibility and support were being distributed. I adjusted my involvement to match that. There it was. Calm, complete, no edge. My mother's face tightened. Not in anger, but in recognition. My father looked down at his cup, then back up at me. "That wasn't meant to change how you're treated," he said. "I know," I replied. And I meant it. But it did change how things functioned, because the plan assumed I would continue contributing in ways that weren't discussed. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just full. My mother spoke again, softer this time. "We didn't realize you felt that way." "I didn't realize it either," I said. Not until it was clear. They asked then, tentatively, whether things could go back to how they were. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. "I'm still willing to help," I said. "But I need clarity. About expectations. About roles. About what's being asked and what's being recognized." There was no apology offered. There didn't need to be. What mattered was the shift in tone, the absence of assumption. For the first time, I wasn't being spoken around. I was being addressed. That was enough. We didn't resolve everything that day. We didn't renegotiate the inheritance. We didn't redraw the past. But something essential changed. They stopped assuming. I stopped compensating. And in that quiet recalibration, the heat that could have burned us was never ignited. I am not the person I was when this story began. Not because I hardened. Not because I withdrew love or became distant. But because I stopped confusing my capacity with my obligation. For a long time, I believed that being capable meant being endlessly available. That strength was proven by how much I could carry without complaint. That dignity lived in silence. I understand now that those beliefs didn't come from malice. They came from adaptation. From learning very early that stability made me useful, and usefulness kept me included. What changed wasn't my values. It was my boundaries. Today, I still help my parents, but I do so within defined roles, with explicit expectations. I no longer absorb ambiguity as a form of loyalty. If something isn't clearly mine to carry, I don't quietly pick it up. Not because I don't care, but because care without clarity becomes erasure. My relationship with my brother has shifted too. There's less ease, but more honesty. He now understands things he never had to consider before. Not because I explained them, but because he had to experience them. We're not closer, but we're more equal in effort. And me? I'm calmer. Not the performative calm of someone suppressing disappointment, but the grounded calm of someone aligned with herself. I trust my perceptions now. I don't rush to neutralize my discomfort. I let it inform me. I also no longer mistake being underestimated for being unseen. Being underestimated can be an advantage, if you're paying attention. What I've learned is this: fairness doesn't announce itself. It's revealed through patterns, through who is protected, who is relied upon, and who is expected to endure quietly. I didn't lose my family through this process. I lost a role that had outlived its usefulness, and in its place, I gained something far more durable: self-respect without spectacle, clarity without cruelty, strength without self-erasure. That's who I am now. When people hear this story, they often ask the same question, even if they don't say it out loud. Was it worth it? They're usually asking about the inheritance, about the numbers, about whether losing 30% instead of 50 feels like a defeat. But that question misses the point. What I gained wasn't measurable in percentages. I gained alignment. For years, I lived slightly misaligned with myself. Just enough to feel tired, but not enough to complain. Just enough to be useful, but not enough to be fully seen. I told myself that harmony was the goal, that understanding others mattered more than understanding my own limits. What I learned is that harmony built on quiet self-erasure is fragile. It holds only as long as one person keeps paying the cost. The moral of this story isn't demand equality at all costs. It isn't cut people off when they disappoint you. And it certainly isn't about punishing those who didn't see you clearly. It's this: if a system only works because you quietly absorb the imbalance, it's not stable. It's borrowed. Borrowed from your energy, borrowed from your time, borrowed from your silence. And anything borrowed without acknowledgement eventually comes due. I didn't force anyone to change. I didn't rewrite the past. I didn't escalate conflict or turn love into leverage. I simply stopped subsidizing decisions I hadn't been invited to make. That was enough. Some relationships survive that shift. Some don't. Mine changed, but they didn't collapse. Because what replaced the old dynamic wasn't distance. It was true. A quieter truth. A slower one, but a real one. If you take anything from this story, let it be this reminder. Being the strong one doesn't mean being the one who takes less forever. Being the easy one doesn't mean you're the one who should cost yourself the most. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing dramatic at all. Just stop correcting what was never fair to begin with. I'll end with a question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was holding up a system that never planned to hold you back? If you have, you're not alone. And if you're noticing it now, that awareness might already be the beginning of your own quiet shift. Thank you for listening.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.